I know that we've been coming back to you several times. I know with the transportation effort, as well as the broader effort to bring the city center at Hanta to fruition. And Adri's talked a little about how the development itself fits in with Mayor Castor's 5 strategic initiatives that have been identified and emphasized within her Transforming Tampa's Tomorrow effort. And she's talked a little about sustainability and resilience, about workforce development, and about development services. Tonight, we specifically wanted to talk about transportation and how that relates to our T3 initiative. In part is that we've changed our approach to communicating with the community about what transportation needs are. And so this process is a little bit different from some of the things that we've done in the past. And we've really kind of, I'll say, blown up the effort and tried to be open to listening continuously and throughout the process of really just engaging with you all. And I think I've said in each of these meetings that we really do appreciate having an engaged community. It keeps us on our toes, it keeps us accountable, and it really keeps our jobs interesting. Not to mention the primary reason for engaging with you all, which is that you as community members know what the problems are that you see from day to day. And so even before we went into the scope definition of this transportation study, we started by having a community listening session back in April. We followed that up by a walking tour over the summer. And then about a month later, we did a community update. We talked about what the scope was, how that was informed by a lot of the feedback that we had received in those two previous events. And then obviously tonight we're going over the results. If you do have a chance to look closely at the study, which was shared a couple of days ago and is available on the City Center website, you'll notice that there are a lot of comments that have been incorporated from those community events, and that the scope of the study itself really was expanded and defined in part based on the comments that we received from you all. So I know that Frank and Adri have been generous with their thanks of you all for your participation, but I want to echo that gratitude for you just really letting us know what is of concern to you so that we can make sure that we're looking in the right place. So the study itself included all of the neighborhoods you see on the screen. It basically went from I-275 to 40th Street east-west and slide to Hillsborough north-south. There were several different work efforts defined within the scope of the study. Some of those were a little bit more focused and didn't necessarily hit every single segment within the study area, but they were all contained within these boundaries, and every segment was looked at in one way or another. Oh, and I should mention the red X in the middle is the actual development site, where you can see the CSX spur coming off of their main track. Just for a little bit of context into how we scoped the study and what we have done. Typically with a development, you'll see a traffic generation and impact study, which was sort of step one for us. We wanted to take a look at how traffic generated by the site would impact the surrounding road network. And like I said, that's typical for a development of any type, but that's really where a new development's look at traffic kind of begins and ends. Like Adri mentioned, we wanted to go beyond what is typical and to engage you all in a broader process. And so the study looks also at a granular safety analysis, sidewalk network analysis, and a prioritization tool. It gives us some segments to prioritize for filling in sidewalk gaps based on some criteria that we have adopted as a city already. It did a school safety analysis, which included some on-site observations and some recommendations about improving school safety and operations. It did a traffic calming evaluation, and this is one of those areas where I mentioned it was within the borders that I showed on the previous slide, but it did not expand to incorporate everything within that. So there were a couple of corridors that were identified in our earlier community engagement that we wanted to take a close look at for traffic calming needs and possibilities. It did a multimodal opportunities evaluation. So basically looked at existing multimodal options that are out there and where we might be able to direct resources to take advantage of more modes than just driving single occupancy vehicles to the site and reducing traffic that way. And it did a travel demand. It gave some recommendations for travel demand management, which is a bit of jargon, but basically it means spreading trips across time. So like Adri mentioned, not having everybody arrive at the work site at the opening bell. So as part of that first analysis, or the first traffic impact analysis, something that every development does is to try to predict how many trips are going to be generated based on the land use. This is pretty uniform across the US, and these generation numbers are informed by a lot of research that goes into the ITE trip generation manual. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds of that, but ITE is an organization, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, it was formerly known as, that does a lot of observation of similar sites, or gathers observations of similar sites that have common characteristics, and says, hey, you know, if you're going to build a gas station with 2 pumps, this is how many trips you can expect. If it's a gas station with 4 pumps, it doubles. If it's a gas station with 8 pumps, it doubles again. Something along those lines. And they're not always a complete linear relationship, but for simplicity's sake, we take a variable that is common to the development and apply that to a generation number to try to understand how people will arrive at the site. And as again, coming back to that whole theme of not having everybody arrive at the same time, we did when we did the impact analysis, we did want to take a conservative approach, and we did basically calculate those numbers based on just an everyday office that doesn't have the same sorts of travel demand management strategies that we intend to employ. So all that to say, I know we had some questions that came in early since we had put the report out a couple of days ago about how trip generation has been calculated. It does take into account all uses within the site. So I just want you to understand that it's not just based on the 500 employees. It really is based on the ITE land use codes, they're called, and the entirety of the site. So the next step, once you figure out how many trips are expected to be generated by this site, is to distribute those across the network and put it through a simulation and say, this is what we expect traffic to be like without site traffic. This is what we expect traffic to be like once we add those site generated trips. And we did this across 3 different timeframes: 2023, 2028, and 2033, and across the entire network. But I did want to spotlight a few of the areas of interest. All of that is available within the report. Most of the intersections had a fairly minor impact to overall delay, but because these were immediately in the vicinity of the site and had a larger impact, I did want to spotlight those as we talk about the results. So within this chart, I've got the intersection delay from Sly and 30th, and the intersection delay from Hannah at 4 different intersections. And you can see, especially the green highlights that I've got, those are where we see the biggest impacts to the existing conditions when we layer on the site generated trips. However, just for, again, having some context and some reference, looking at Sly and 30th, it's a fairly substantial delay, even if we say, you know, for whatever reason, we're not going to do this development at the city center, we're not going to build it, we're still seeing 123 seconds or 2 minutes of intersection delay in the AM peak with background traffic and 420 seconds in the PM peak. So while I wanted to highlight these because this is where some of the recommendations came in, it's important to note that not all of the impacts and not all of the traffic issues that we see or that were identified in the study are directly attributable to the city center traffic. So the next step, so we did the traffic impact analysis. The next step was a safety analysis. It included a granular look at crashes throughout the area. And again, I know that we had some questions early on in the week about some specific segments. If you look at the report itself, there are some, there's a section in the body of the report that summarizes and spotlights some of the crash summaries of intersections that are noteworthy and that are close to the development itself. In Appendix F, it does go into some additional intersection crash analysis that didn't sort of rise to the top when it came down to summarizing it. You can also see on this slide, there's an overlay of the sidewalk network. Everything that's green includes a sidewalk. Everything that, excuse me, that is black or sort of gray does not have a sidewalk. And part of the analysis process was to look and prioritize where we should fill in some of those gaps. There's a lot of gaps there, and we have limited funding to address them. So we really need to figure out what the highest priorities should be. So within that crash analysis, it's pretty typical for us to look at 5 years of crash data to categorize those by the crash type and contributing circumstances. If there's some sort of identified pattern, then the recommendation is to sort of take a step back and say, what can this pattern be attributed to? Another sort of step beyond the typical approach was that we included a road safety audit, which includes a multidisciplinary professional team that goes out and takes a look at the area, at the roadway with their own eyes, because sometimes the data-driven approach of just looking at where crashes have happened doesn't identify some of the potential hazards that we can see just by being out there on site. So as a result of the safety analysis, there were some recommended improvements to changing the geometry of crosswalks and curb radii, especially particularly on Hannah. Some multimodal accommodation, again, also centered as much on Hannah as anything. Some lighting improvements and some drainage improvements. Those drainage improvements were identified partly as a result of just some observations with the road safety audit, and partly as a response to some of the wet condition crashes that we're seeing. The next step was the traffic calming analysis. I mentioned earlier that there were a couple of corridors that were spotlighted based on the community feedback we got, that we looked at traffic calming opportunities and possibilities, specifically looking at Hannah between 15th and 40th, looking at 24th Street between Hannah and Sly, and looking at 23rd Street between Hannah and Idlewild. I'm not sure that there's someone marking on the screen. So the recommendations based on the traffic calming analysis were, again, also related to the safety analysis from before, geometric modifications on Hannah, some speed feedback signs on both Hannah and 24th Street, and then eventually the possible addition of a sidewalk on 24th Street. If you're familiar with the corridor, it's pretty tight right of way, and there are some real design challenges to that, but taking a closer look and evaluating the possibility of putting a sidewalk on that street is one of the traffic calming strategies that we have been asked to consider. And then last, the travel demand management. Again, we mentioned some of these things we anticipate doing, but did not want to incorporate in some of the impact analyses because we wanted to take a conservative approach, and we don't want to take for given something that that is still in the either the possibility or that doesn't have a clear method of implementation just yet, but that we are pursuing. So that includes coordinating with HART for transit access on Hannah. I know this is a topic that came up in previous community engagement, and just for context, if you haven't been part of those conversations, there, as I understand it, there was previously a bus route that went on Hannah in front of the site. It was removed as part of their route reprioritization or route reduction for funding reasons. We do not have direct control over HART's routing, but we do have a good relationship with them, and will continue to engage with them for possibly including a route that goes directly to the city center. But there are routes currently that go north-south on either side, on both 22nd and on 30th. Second recommendation was to encourage multimodal usage through design. This is something that is already taking place within the site design. To emphasize existing transit benefits to city employees. If you don't know, the city offers as a benefit to city employees discounted transit fare. And simply publicizing that better, we anticipate having an impact on who takes advantage of it, how many people do, especially as they automatically have to reconsider how they get to work whenever they're reporting to a new site. Consider flexible or teleworking arrangements. We have hammered on this already. Again, to be conservative, to give a worst case scenario, we did not build that into the model, but any of these things will reduce the expected impact. And then to consider pursuing additional site access from Henry Avenue on the south side. And I know this, again, something that came up in the walking tour and that has come up numerous times. The big challenge with that is that the property to the south of the city center site is private property. We don't have site control. So we were not comfortable committing to getting that done, again, as part of being conservative in our approach. It's not off the table by any means, but we don't have, because we don't have direct site control, that might be a longer term process. And if the private property owners are not in favor of it, then obviously that is an obstacle to us. So putting all this together, the recommendations that HNTB gave us were organized into near-term, intermediate-term, and long-term recommendations. And there are timeframes on these. Near-term is within 2 years, intermediate term is within 5 years, long-term is beyond 5 years. I want to be clear that those timeframes are not commitments for us to doing these. They're not commitments that we will do these things within these timeframes, but they're benchmarks for us to look at as we prioritize. And Cal's going to get a little bit more into that whenever I turn it over to him. So that said, near-term recommendations include the potential signalization at Sly and 30th. I mentioned earlier that it has a failing level of service with or without the development. And we will need to take a step between now and the possible signalization to do a signal warrant analysis to just make sure that it's the right solution for the right intersection. But it did seem to make a difference in the model. School area improvements, including various signing and pavement marking modifications. I'll get into a little bit more of the specifics on that. Speed feedback signs on Diana Street, Hannah Avenue, and 24th Street. I mentioned a couple of those. Diana Street was part of the school recommendations, and then multimodal coordination with HART. Not to focus in on Sly and 30th at the expense of everything else, but it was one that really stood out within the analysis as something that we need to take a closer look at. School area improvements. Some of these are things that we don't necessarily have to program into our capital program, but we can address with our operations forces and our operations budget. At Foster Elementary, the recommendations included pavement marking enhancements on 22nd and Diana, basically school zone marking, an addition of sidewalk on Diana, speed feedback signs on Diana I mentioned, and enhanced parking restrictions on Diana. Again, as part of the early comments that we've gotten back, I understand that the parking issue on Diana also continues down 21st. So as we look at better signage or better clarity on where people should park their cars, we will keep 21st in mind as well. At Sly Middle, the recommendations included enhanced crossings on 22nd and Sly, signing and pavement marking enhancements, again, mirroring that at Foster, and then turn lane improvements on Sly. So those were the short-term recommendations. The intermediate-term recommendations included additional intersection lighting, adding bicycle lanes on Hannah. Basically, the typical cross-section that is shown in the graphic on the screen is what we would be going for along Hannah. To fill sidewalk gaps, they prioritized throughout the prioritization process. What came out was the gaps on Diana, Sly, Hannah, Henry, and 22nd, some specific segments of those. And to add mid-block crossings with rectangular rapid flashing beacons, again at 21st Street, at Sly near pedestrian generators. I included this really as a reference point because we've had some feedback about what the cross-section of Hannah should look like and whether it should be expanded. And there are several corridors across the city where we've taken a look at the cross sections that have in years past been expanded, and specifically 4-lane sections, and really questioned, is this the right approach? And looked at the possibility of doing a road diet or a complete streets project to reduce that to 2 lanes with either a continuous 2-way left turn lane or intermediate left turn lanes as needed. And we look at a lot of different guidance from different sources, one of which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. So I took a snippet from one of their complete streets guidance documents, just again as a reference point to say, that's the sort of cross section that we anticipate working for roads that are up to around 20 to even 25,000 ADT, which is average daily traffic. And so for comparison's sake, the current ADT on Hannah is between 6 and 8,000, depending on which block you're looking at. So we think that with the addition of a left turn lane into the site, that maintaining 2 through lanes, 1 in each direction, is the right cross section for that facility. So long-term solutions or long-term recommendations that were recommended by the report include the potential southbound left turn lane at Hannah and 22nd. That's something that is going to be pretty tough just because the right-of-way is very tight. So we'll have to take a close look at that and see what limitations or what obstacles we have to overcome with that as a possibility. Potentially signalizing Hannah and 15th. If you don't know, Hannah and 15th, we added a 4-way stop fairly recently. A potential northbound left turn lane at Sly and 30th. And just as a side note, to keep our approach practical, we would certainly consider, if we do decide to pursue a traffic signal at that intersection, we would certainly consider doing the northbound left turn lane at the same time, if we can manage to fund that. a potential two-way left turn lane for a short section on Sly, basically around the school, and around I can't remember, it's a Family Dollar or a Dollar Tree in that area. And then an additional sidewalk on the west side of 24th between Hannah and Sly. That was mentioned as a traffic calming measure earlier, but it's also a possibility. I mean, it's also a gap that provides some functionality. We've certainly observed people using that facility without a current sidewalk. It's fairly tight right of way. Again, there are some trees that might make it a little bit difficult, but design challenges are things that we undertake as part of the process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cal. Cal's going to talk about our project prioritization and programming process, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so can y'all hear me? Everybody can hear me? Thumbs up, Brandon. Yeah, okay. So I'm Cal Hardy. I'm the Capital Projects Manager for the Transportation Division of the Mobility Department. It's my team's purview to monitor and develop the projects and get them from design to construction. So I just wanted to kind of talk about where we are now. This meeting is a part of a continued conversation that we're having with the neighborhood. And before I get into specifics on the programming projects for the capital program, I did want to give y'all some good references to go by. So we have our Tampa Moves, which is basically our mobility plan. It's a 30-year framework for how we prioritize projects in the future. Our website for that is www.tampamoves.org. On that website, there's ways to let us know how you would improve railway safety in Tampa. And there's a link there to actually provide input, as well as a mapping tool to show us areas of concerns. There's also a link to something called our low stress bike network. And if you are a bike commuter, it allows you to see where we have enhanced facilities and things like that to make it a little bit, we're off the presentation slide there. Sorry. But anyway, the low stress bike network is something that can be used to go through and kind of see where our facilities are in the area. And then finally, some information on Vision Zero. Vision Zero is something that a lot of cities are adopting. We have adopted it. And it's basically, the premise is crashes are crashes are going to happen, but we are striving for a goal of zero deaths and significant injuries. So we believe those are preventable, and we're trying to achieve that through a series of things, including better design and also community engagement. So a lot of good resources there to go check out. Those links are all important. All right, so just to kind of get in and tell you that's the nuts and bolts of the report. But I kind of want to give y'all a realistic idea of how we program projects, how we prioritize projects, and what our funding picture is. Basically, what we have there is a developable piece of land. In this case, the city is the developer. So generally, when a developer comes in, they do a report. Our report goes well above and beyond what a developer would do. The good thing is, having the city as the developer, we're not going anywhere unless there's a major act of God that none of us want, but we should be y'all's neighbors for a long time, and we want to be good neighbors. So the report basically is a small area study that lists a bunch of the issues within the area. It's not necessarily part of the development, but it kind of goes more holistically, looking at the area and saying, hey, these are some improvements that you can do within the area. There are many more recommendations in that report than what can be implemented immediately. That's why they have some short-term, mid-term, and long-term recommendations. But that's where capital projects programming comes in. So basically, we take the findings of that report and prioritize them based off of safety and operational needs, and then we have to balance them across other needs across the entire city. Just to give you an idea of what our funding situation is, in 2018, they had the transportation surtax, which was enacted with 67% of the vote. That surtax would have quintupled our actual budget on a yearly basis, and it was unfortunately struck down by the Supreme Court because of some of the language in the referendum. Hillsborough County is actually starting initial input meetings. There's actually one tonight on the new referendum. So they are looking at putting a new referendum on the budget, or on the for 2020 to vote on. But with the loss of the revenue that we had planned on surtax, now our only continuing source of funding is gas tax. That's our only dedicated source of transportation funding in the city that we can rely on, and that's what we program our projects off of. Gas tax is charged cents per gallon. It's not a percentage. So when you go to the gallon of gas might go up to $3, might be $1, doesn't matter. It's cents per gallon. So that cents per gallon hasn't been raised since 1993. And in that time, there's been an 84% loss in purchase power. So it's not pegged to inflation. Basically, we get the same amount of money that we were getting in 1993 as we do now. In that same time, the amount of cars on the road has gone up significantly. And as infrastructure ages and more cars on the road, that causes more damage to the infrastructure. And as it ages, the damage is more significant. So we encounter a lot more greater maintenance costs than we did before. Our gas tax, the city brings in about $9 million a year. That's our money to use for maintenance of all of our roadways, bridges, seawalls, all of our safety improvements, sidewalks, all the rest. We do have some other funds like multimodal fees and lieu fees, but those are usually pretty small, and they're not generally, they're not a constant stream. We don't know exactly how much we're going to get from each of those each year. So they're tied to development. And then there's also some exempt areas in that as well. So with that $9 million, the good thing is we are pretty good at the city at leveraging those funds to get other funding through federal programs and grants and things like that. So generally we average, all total, we average about another $5-6 million a year in grants, and then maybe some multimodal fee use as well. So we do a good job of getting those grants. Now, the bad part about relying upon grants is that it significantly impacts the delivery of projects. Programming a project through grants requires demonstrating need, and it's generally through programs such as Highway Safety Improvement Program or Transportation Alternatives Program. Those two programs, you need to either show a safety need or an alternative need, a multimodal need within a community, and then those projects are ranked and then they are approved and prioritized through the TPO. But the long and short of it is relying on grant. The biggest problem with it is that if we go ahead and get a grant for a project today and we demonstrate that need, that project is 6 years out immediately because it gets put into the back year. So I'm telling you all this just to kind of give a bigger picture overview of how we fund projects and what our funding limitations are, just to kind of put all this into perspective, and then to also let y'all know that anything in the report will have to be screened through what we can do now, what is a priority here, as well as what's a priority elsewhere in the city, and then trying to figure out what the best projects to move forward with in the near term and medium term and long term. So with that, I don't really have anything other to say in that, but I can, we'll all be around to answer some questions. Brandon, if you want to do the next slide. So there you go.
So as we continue the conversation, we can go through some of the questions that have come in. But if you think about others as they come up, either if you're reviewing the report itself or based on what we've said tonight, certainly shoot us an email, give us a call, and we will answer all of those questions. We would like to have questions back by Friday, the 25th, which is a little over 2 weeks from now, just so that we can manage our consultant resources and our internal process and keep things moving. But if you have questions now, I know that we've had some on the chat.
Yes, Brandon, we've had several questions on the chat. Thank you all for staying with us and participating. And we do have several questions here, and I'm going to start reading some of those questions now so that you and the team can begin to answer those questions. The first question is from Amanda Brown, who resides in the Seminole Heights or Old Seminole Heights area, and she also works with the Seminole Heights East community. Amanda says, Brandon talks about the ITE includes all uses. Specifically, what code does that fall under when it comes to fleet and fleet services?
Sure, I will let Gilbert hit that one directly as he did the trip generation numbers.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
So yeah, so IT specifically doesn't have a fleet services as per yet. So what we did was, in order to be more conservative, we incorporated that as part of pretty much the employees and all of that for conservative analysis. And at the same time, Brandon, I think we had this conversation. I think you indicated that these fleet services wouldn't be part of the typical AM and PM type of time frame. So it'll mainly be operating during the off-peak, right?
Yes, yeah. So generally, the employees of the fleet services section should be included in that 500 employee trip generation number. That's the top line of that chart.
Yeah.
But other trips, we don't really expect to be concentrated in the AM and PM peak, if that makes sense. And I know we had some questions, again, that came through email about things like the product delivery and car carrier and larger vehicle arrivals at fleet services specifically. We don't anticipate that being a regular occurrence during the AM and PM peak. So the impact analysis focused on those two timeframes.
Brandon, Susan Long from Old Seminole Heights asked the question, if you're going to add sidewalks on Sly, how far west will those sidewalks go?
So I don't remember that Sly was part of the sidewalk recommendation. Let me pull it up. I think I started to do so in the middle of Cal's talking. So the sidewalk prioritization tool included Hannah 22nd in these segments that are on the screen now. So 15th to 19th on the north side of Hannah, Nebraska to 9th on the south side of Hannah, 22nd to the nearest driveway on the north side of Henry, and 22nd from Henry to Hannah on the east side. Ken, do you remember sidewalk segment on Sly being recommended?
I don't specifically, unless George does. Kind of one of the things that we could say about the sidewalk prioritization is we did want to make sure initially that the sidewalks around the site gave continuous access for pedestrians to move to and from the site. So as you saw by the list that Brandon showed you, the focus was on Hannah to make sure that it incorporated the missing segments around the site and all the way from 22nd to 30th.
I guess it's also worth noting that on Sly, we do have a fairly continuous sidewalk on the south side. No, not fairly. It looks like we have a continuous sidewalk all the way from the 275 interchange to River Grove on the south side of Sly. So especially given that that is the side that the middle school is on, I don't think that it actually made it into the recommendations for additional sidewalk gap fills. It may have been confusing the way that I phrased the sidewalk on 24th to Sly. I don't know if that influenced that question at all, but we would be looking at that as a long-term possibility all the way from Hannah to Sly.
Okay, so thank you for that. Now, Joy Dew of Live Oaks Square, she has more of a comment than a question. Joy says, there was an accident at the intersection of Hannah and 22nd and 24th Street today. This is the second accident that I've come across, and speed is definitely a factor. I think that speaks to more about some of those transportation concerns that you brought up in the presentation.
Yeah, and without speculating too much on the characteristics of that crash, I know you mentioned speed being a factor. That's likely speed on Hannah rather than 24th, since it is a T intersection there. And the speed feedback signs as a recommended countermeasure on Hannah are things that, again, we might be able to do even absent a larger capital project.
The next question is from Robert Gatson of Seminole Heights East. His question is this: did this study take into account that there is a 100+ unit apartment complex being built on 24th Street between Sly and Hannah that will also be adding hundreds more daily trips to the immediate area?
So looking in on 24th Street, on 24th Street between Sly and Hannah, this area right here.
Correct.
Govardhan, was that identified?
No, that wasn't specifically identified as part of the study. We incorporated the study one from Hillsborough that we have the information on, but what we did was, as part of the timeframes that you specified, Brandon, from 23 to 28 to 33 to 2033, we incorporated the growth rate as part of the study area. So part of some of it could be captured in that, but specifically the 100+ units has not been incorporated in the study. We did not have that information at the time of the study.
I have another question here. This question comes from Miss Gadsden. And she has 3 questions, but the first one is most relevant to what we're talking about here. Will you find out why 34th Street and Hannah, that there's going to be, I'm sorry for this, let me go back and rephrase this question. Basically, what she wants to know is about the impacts along 34th Street and Hannah. And there's a lot of traffic along those streets. And it also, there's a bottleneck of cars on 40th Street that sometimes intersects with traffic on Hannah and 34th Street. Can you talk about that?
So the assumptions about routing to the site in the AM peak centered more around, at least from Hillsborough, coming up 40th and taking the roundabout to go into Hannah, or coming up 30th and taking a left onto Hannah. Not so much on 34th. Let me see if I could pull up the.
And Brandon, she's also very interested in the crash data as it relates to those streets, 34th Street in particular.
Got it. So the crash data is contained in Appendix F. Let me pull that up real quick. I know where that is. think. Scrolling may not have been the best method. Sorry.
Hey, Brandon, it's a PDF page 280.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So on 34th, we've got, that's Hannah, Nebraska. Hannah 15th, Hannah 22nd, Hannah 24th. Were you asking specifically about Hannah and 34th? Do we know?
Correct. Specifically about Hannah and 34th.
Okay. It looks like we did not do a detailed look at Hannah and 34th.
Okay. Would you be
I
able
can
to
speak-
talk? Okay,
I
go
can
ahead,
speak
please,
on that.
George.
Yeah, so when we were identifying intersections to summarize within the crash summary tables that you're seeing in front of you, we took a high level overview. And so you can kind of see that within the heat maps that we had provided on the, I think on the front end portion of the report that showed like the frequency of crashes and like the prominent locations. And so Hannah and 34th wasn't quite identified as a high crash location. Although, I mean, like we can certainly like look at that intersection for additional details, but for the time being, when we were performing the intersection analysis, yeah, at least Hannah and 34th was not one of those identified.
Thank you, George. Our next question comes from Mr. Tim Keyports of Old Seminole Heights. This question is for Calvin Hardy. The question is this: does a developer, in this case the city, have to complete a traffic study prior to the approval of a project?
Brandon, you might be able to answer that better than me. I don't do the traffic. I'm on the roadway side, the other type of engineer.
So it's dependent on the existing development and what trips that it's entitled to. Basically, a traffic study. Actually, let me take a step back. So the purpose of a traffic study for a new development, taking the city out of the equation as the developer, is generally to calculate a fee. So a site would have so many trips entitled based on this one in particular, based on the previous development, and additional trips generated by a new development would then be fed into the same sort of traffic impact analysis that we've done. And then the level of service would then be taken a look at, and potential mitigation efforts, we'll say a signal at 30th and Sly as an example, would be looked at, and the cost to implement those kinds of projects would be used as a baseline to calculate a fee to say, okay, we're using up this percentage of the capacity of the roadway with our site generated traffic. And it's generally a very small percentage of the usage of that roadway. It's a little bit of a complicated approach to doing things, but I think it's important to note that the end result of those kinds of traffic studies is not necessarily a roadway improvement implemented in the street. We wanted to take a different approach where we say, these are the things that we can physically go out there and do to make a difference to traffic flow in the neighborhood. And so it really is a step beyond what any developer would be willing or required to do.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that too. And that's kind of what I was talking about with the above and beyond what a developer is required to do. Because Brandon's correct, it's basically they pay a fee. What we're looking at is not necessarily, we looked at this area holistically, not as part of this proposed site per se, but also to say, okay, well, what other concerns are in this general area? So that's kind of why I was talking about these projects are projects that will need to be programmed over time. And to kind of say like, what we're looking at is more, here's all the problem areas that we have found. And it's basically saying we need to focus on these areas.
Calvin, as a follow-up to that question, this is for you and Brandon. I've got a question here from Florence Marsan. The question is, if only those utilization funds went directly to mass transit in that area to minimize the impact. I think it's more of a statement, but I think what she's trying to do is maybe ask about the possibility of that happening.
Well, I'll follow that up with the fact that the referendum that we currently had, the city was only, I think 47% of the entirety of that referendum that was passed in 2018 was awarded to HART. The other 53% was split amongst the other municipalities in the county based off a percentage of population. So the majority of the funds were going to HART. We don't fund transit at the city. We don't operate transit for the most part. Well, we don't operate any transit. So, but my funding is, or the city's funding, I should say, is completely different than any transit funding that we have. But I will agree with you on the point that you're trying to make about, to be completely honest, the lack of funding for all agencies, including HART, is a big issue within the mobility of the region.
Another question goes back to 24th Street. You all talked about 24th Street just a moment ago. This time, taking into consideration Minnehaha and 24th, Maria Velez is very concerned about traffic in that particular area. And then on top of that, she has concerns about wheelchairs. She or I guess a family member happens to use wheelchairs. What are they going to do?
Okay, so I'll take this one too. Let me take it into a couple pieces. When we do a capital project on a roadway, we improve all of our projects with wheelchair access, and we do look at accessibility needs across the corridor. So during our maintenance projects, same thing. We do look at that and try to fix all the access needs that we have on those corridors. So on a project, that would be taken care of on that basis. However, if there are specific needs for mobility needs that you and your family members have, what you can do for the city is there's an ADA coordinator. And Raquel, we work with her constantly, and Raquel is a good person to get in touch with and let her know about specific needs. And then we have sidewalk prioritization tools that try to handle those needs when they arise. So what I would suggest to you is we can get you the ADA coordinator's contact information. And regardless of what we're trying to do here with this study at all, just let us know about those needs, and then we can take that into account when we look into sidewalk prioritization.
I have two more questions here. The first question comes from Mr. Tim Keyports, and then I'm going to take a question from Ms. Gatson. The question from Mr. Keyports is this, and this question is for Brandon. The safety crash analysis focused only on East Hannah, 15th to 40th Street, North 24th, Hannah to Sly, and North 23rd, south of Hannah, and identified must-do improvements. Here comes the question. We need to have 30th Street, a major north-south corridor, and called out as a problematic, and Hannah from Nebraska to 15th as well, be studied in the same manner. So it's not really a question. I'm sorry, it's more of a statement about wanting 30th Street as well as Hannah to be studied. What's your thoughts on that?
So we did actually look at those segments. There is some information in Appendix F. It was not spotlighted in the summary and the body of the report. So there is still some information on a granular level on some of those segments that you mentioned. I don't know, George, if you want to add to that.
No, I think that kind of like covered most of it. I think, yeah, we have specific tables for each of the major intersections of crashes that we had observed over on Appendix F. And so, yeah, so those are available for the public to view.
And I will add that last slide with the links that talks about Tampa Moves, just to get everybody an idea of what Tampa Moves is. That is the framing or framework for transportation improvements. And that group, we have a planning group that actually looks at this, and they look at what we call our high injury network. It's the corridors that we experience the most of our accidents on, most of our crashes, I should say. And it's the areas that we try to focus on based off of that. So with that Tampa Moves website, those are things that, with crash data in general, there are things that aren't recorded in crash data, near misses, smaller fender benders, things like that, that always have an opportunity for injury. So those are the kind of things that if you're seeing on a daily basis, but it's not out there, then it's not recorded, then that's stuff that we want to hear from you guys. So please talk to us. It's a conversation. Let us know where you're seeing these issues, and please use the resources that we have, because that's the way that we can capture those.
Brandon, if you could put the information on the screen again for Tampa Moves and exactly what Cal was just talking about. And then also, I'm going to move on to the question from Ms. Gatson. Her question starts with a statement about TICO poles. The TICO poles are appear to be along Hannah Avenue and not in the streets south of Hannah. Are they a regional point for heavy-duty electricity in the area? The question she asked is, why were they constructed along Hannah Avenue and not Hillsborough Avenue, which is already zoned commercial? So it's really a question for TICO, but I think what she's getting at here is those poles being not just unsightly, but also what's the risk there for pedestrians if we want to have sidewalks or more sidewalks in the area? Do the TICO poles pose some sort of problem for that?
I can answer that one too. So the TICO poles that you're referring to, the larger poles are distribution, or smaller poles are distribution. The larger poles are transmission. Unfortunately, with overhead lines, you basically have to have the larger poles are basically the highways, and the smaller poles are the little local streets. They get you to the service to the house, but they're not restricted on just like it's based off of where TICO has needs their distribution lines and transmission lines to be. In terms of how we handle that when we do for sidewalk needs, we are required to meet ADA standards. The city owns a right of way, and where it's city right of way. And when we've done projects in the past where we've done ADA improvements, we have asked them to relocate those poles. But generally, it's kind of on a case-by-case basis, and we need to have a project to alert them that they need to move the pole. So that's that.
As a follow-up to that, Cal, Mauricio Rosas has a question. How do we correct the utility poles in mid-sidewalk? So they're along, I believe it's along Hannah. There might be maybe towards Hannah and 30th, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
A sidewalk, a utility pole that's really close to a sidewalk or in the middle of a sidewalk.
Yep, and Sly as well. So, and it gets doubly compounded when we have solid waste collection, and you get temporary use, like putting solid waste containers out on the sidewalks that even further limit it. We're aware of the issue. We had a similar issue on Beta Bay when we were looking at that project. Generally, we request for TICO to go out, and the way that they would have to do that is either go through a private utility easement and actually move the pole off the sidewalk, or they can move it and relocate it to the back right of way. And that way, as long as we have enough clearance to meet ADA in that area, then they're fine. But we know it's an issue. It's an issue all over the city, and it's something that needs to be basically done granularly, like as we move through the city and rebuild our corridors and our infrastructure.
Okay, thank you for that, Cal. The next question continues with our sidewalk theme, this time from Esther Cooley. and she's concerned about sidewalks along 24th Street. Although that is a part of the long-range plan, her concern is that for those sidewalks to be installed, half of the residents' front yard will probably have to be seized in order for that to take place. So she wants to know, why is the city still looking at placing sidewalks along 24th? And then I also would like for you to address her concern about the yard frontage of the residents having to be purchased.
Yeah, I can talk on that. So generally, it depends on a case. Like, I don't know where the property line is, and oftentimes our right-of-way line, the property line, the private property line, and everything outside of it is the right-of-way line, falls within that grass strip between the house and the roadway. So what people generally call their front yards is a lot of that time is public land, where we would, if it doesn't have a sidewalk now, that's just because when Tampa, a lot of Tampa was developed, they didn't put sidewalks in. But you know, now as we try to go on, there is a portion of that grass that is city owned and is, or I should say, publicly owned, that we can use for public access, like mobility needs for sidewalk and stuff like that. I don't know specifically on 24th Street until we get right-of-way use, but we don't take land without any kind of, we can't just go ahead and build a sidewalk on private property. We can't just go ahead and take land. That's not the way it works. It's a long drawn out process. If we do need land, it's we prefer to get a voluntary acquisition. But that's a whole process. It takes we get real estate, there's appraisals, there's all kinds of things that are involved with that. So, but generally, a lot of that land, that grass area is not, it is public land, not privately owned.
So at this point, gentlemen, we're going to wrap up. We've got time for one last question. And that question is going to go back to the finance aspect of this, and it's from Casey Curry. Her question is this: where do the previously assessed transportation impact fees go? Are they used in the area of the assessed property? Are they dedicated to transportation? How is the money spent?
Yes, 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 and yes. So they are used in there's multimodal transportation impact fee districts. East District, there's maps online that you can look at, but money collected from developments within that district is put into that district for capacity or multimodal needs on collector roads within that area. So everything that we collect there does get put back into the area that we collected from. And as far as, I mean, we have fund balances. I don't know exactly what the last one we used for. I believe this would be Central East, if I'm correct on that one. I don't know the last project I have for Central East. I think it might be for Nebraska, is an upcoming project where we're using some of the multimodal feeds there. But and I know there are some developments in the area that are also coming up and actually putting money into those coffers as well.
Thank you, Calvin. Just wanted to really, again, thank everyone. We went just a little over tonight, but I know that this was a lot of information. We made this report available to you on Monday, but it's very different. It can be interpreted differently. And so I'm so thankful to Brandon and Calvin and George and Ken and the experts on the line that really unpacked it for us and interpreted it for us and shared with us what this all meant. I wanted to also thank our partners with HNTB. They invested a lot of time in the neighborhood, knowing how important this is to us. As Brandon mentioned, and we've said it before, but I really want to make sure everyone understands, the city of Tampa is moving into this neighborhood as your neighbor. That's been a huge message that Mayor Castor has shared with us. So we've gone above and beyond what any other developer would, because we're not just a developer. We're moving there as your neighbors, and we look forward to being there with you. We went over a lot of information tonight. Many of you may still have questions after this is over. Please, we encourage you to send the questions in, or you can call Frank Crum. Again, his number is on the screen, as is the email address. Thank you, Frank, for putting that up there. So if additional questions come to mind, please send them in. We want to respond to you all, and we want to continue this partnership that we have formed and that is so important to us. Again, one last reminder, DPR, the contractor building the city center at Hannah Avenue, will be having an informational session, and we're looking for people to work on that site. So if you know of anyone interested in being a sub contractor or working on the site, please join them on February 16th at Reagan Park from 3 to 4:30. Thank you all again. Have a wonderful evening.